this evening.
Well, yes, when put that way, I don't think I have a choice, right?
Exactly. So good evening, everybody. It is February 1st, 2022, and I am just so grateful to be able to welcome you to another program, Real Talk, Family Life, Building Shatterproof Families, one brick at a time. It is such a delight to have those of you joining us on Zoom and on YouTube. We have an exciting program for you this evening. We're going to be talking about rebellion, perhaps not in the way that you anticipate. However, I am sure that, guided by the Holy Spirit, we will learn quite a few things this evening, and we just, as usual, encourage you to raise your hands, use the emojis, post in the chats on Zoom and on YouTube so that our panelists this evening can address your questions, your queries, your concerns, maybe respond to your comments. I am your host, Dr. Sasha Sutherland, and with me this evening is Mr. David Andrew, counseling psychologist, and Reverend Dr. Roger Samuel, counselor, traumatologist, and pastor. Good evening, gentlemen. I'm just gonna ask you to say hello, to greet everyone. Still a new year, only the second month. So say hi and let's move.
Hi. Hello, good evening. Happy New Year to everyone. It's good to be in 2022 and alive and kicking. And so it's a lot to be grateful for. I'm looking forward to a whole lot. So it's good to see all these faces, or some are supposedly faces. I hope they represent people and not just imagery. So.
All right. Well, good evening, everybody. It's good to be with you again in your company through this medium and to be able to speak with you and not about you. I mean, and truthfully, I mean that because within the last couple of months, the last year, 2 years, there are so many people that we are now only privileged to talk about and not to or with. And so when we get the opportunity to speak with each other, it is indeed a privilege. And so it's a privilege to be able to speak with you this evening through this medium. And let me wish all of you a very productive, meaningful, and fulfilling 2022 this year. And may everything that you desire, every good thing that you have in your heart, the desire, put your hand to, may those things be realized optimally. Good to be with you.
Thank you, gentlemen. I also want to acknowledge Pastor Henry and Pastor Griffith joining us tonight, and a special welcome to our participants as usual. So Pastor Samuel, Mr. Andrew, let's jump right in. A simplistic definition of this word rebellion is just basically, opposition to someone in authority or someone who is exercising dominance. And we're talking about the rebellious child. I want to kind of frame rebellion, and I know you guys are not going to allow us to just use a carte blanche definition. I know when we talk about rebellion, we're talking about the terrible twos? Are we talking about a teenager? Are we talking about a young adult? And so there are different ways in which we can define rebellion, and then different ways in which we might identify rebellion based on age groups. So I just want to ask, how can we look at rebellion from a clinical perspective, and how do we apply what we know about rebellion to different age groups? Is rebellion a learned behavior? Is it something that's innate? A huge mouthful just to start the conversation. What is rebellion? David, if I can start with you.
Right. So thank you. And I would simply stick with the definition that you've given. That act of resisting authority or someone in positions of authority or control, that tendency to do that. And let me quickly say, rebellion can easily be a developmental norm. And I think you've alluded to that, because at various developmental stages, rebellion becomes a part of becoming, a part of finally arriving at a place. So it's part of a process. You talked about the terrible twos. That child who keeps saying no, no, no. It's not that that child really wants to oppose authority per se, but it's part of the child's own discovery of themselves and how language works, and trying to express their own sense of autonomy as a person. And then when you get to teenage years, for instance, where the reasoning gets different and teenagers reason at a different level to the 6, 7, 8, 9-year old, the 14-year-old, 15-year-old will tell you something different because they reason at a different point. And so they challenge, they oppose, and nothing is wrong with that. So developmentally, I want us to get clear that it is developmentally appropriate and necessary. If that doesn't happen developmentally in many persons, it's as if a part of the process is not being realized. So I want us to get that clear. But then there is the point at which, considering all of these, there is still that defiance. After the reasoning is put, after you account for the developmental stages, particularly in more adolescent level children, there is still the defiance. And usually that is a show that something is amiss. It's a response to something that didn't align itself well, some maladaptation, some a cry, some show that they're responding to something that is not quite the way it's supposed to be. And what that is something that we can obviously explore. And then they rebel in different ways depending on what it is. It could have been repressed experiences. It could easily have been things they didn't get a chance to express. And when in fact, when children don't get the opportunity to express things verbally, things they can't say, they act out, and they act in different ways in various forms of rebellion, and we can talk about that a little bit later. So sometimes it points to a deficiency, a lack somewhere, something that's not going right, beyond the normalcy, the developmental appropriateness of the rebellion as part of the process. I'll just submit that.
Dr. Samuel.
I think too, as they were talking, you know, sometimes they were exposed to traumatic things, you know, in their family fights, family squabble, violence, even sometimes double standards, you know, like one parent has one value system and the other has another value system. So the kids are competing, and so they're exposed to different types of situations in their lives that contribute to them being in rebellion or rebellious. And you wonder, well, why are they behaving this way and what's happening with them? But sometimes it's something that they were exposed to. And sometimes they may see the adults acting out certain behavior that they begin to mimic. And then when they, you know, the adult expect them to then behave a certain way, they are now questioning, why are you not following through on the things that you were taught? Because, you know, what we learn is what do as I say and that as I do. So oftentimes we come face to face with that reality. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes we are amazed to know that they are learning by what they see and by what they're exposed to. And there may have been some traumatic situation that may have affected them negatively. And then they repress, as David said, and then eventually find they're acting out and in ways that you don't expect, and you don't know where it's coming from. So there could be a number of reasons, where that rebellion start. And I think I may have mentioned some time ago, sometimes you may even have a child with delayed development, mm-hmm. and you may say, I'm not complying. And a teacher might see the child not complying in school and thinking, well, this child is just not sticking it to the rules, but maybe something is going on. And if the teacher is not aware that there's some challenges mentally and there's some developmental challenges, then they could brand them and label them as rebellious and not compliant. And then the other students, they can laugh at them and then they even act out more. So sometimes there can be, quite a few reasons why the different manifestation of rebellion in children that we need to pay attention to as parents and educators to ensure we pay close attention and not always react to what we think is non-compliant, but sometimes try to understand what's going on in the background.
So you gave us a lot to feed on in terms of consistency of behaviors, consistency of exposure to good value systems within a home, and then what might be non-compliant behavior, not necessarily an indication of rebellion. And those are a lot to grapple with. So if I can ask for a practical example in terms of, consistency of good values within the home. Is it that we're talking about within the home, you have to have an identifiable value system about the way we behave, as a Sutherland, you do this, you don't do this. As a Sutherland, you say this, but you don't say this. But then that behavior has to not just be said, as you said, Dr. Samuel, not do as I say, but do as I do as well. So the consistency between what is spoken and what is modeled for that child has to be consistent. But then you learn the maladaptive behaviors, going back to your comments, Mr. Andrew, based on the example speaking a lot louder than the words of the parents in the home. If we can just ask you to break that down a bit, because I think it segues into how, as educators or Christian educators, we then start to identify what really is rebellious and callous behavior versus natural inclinations towards, sinful natures that might be corrected. So if you can give us practical examples, and then we'll segue into how we identify. Unmute.
I'm sorry, I thought I was unmuted all the while. Right, so I'm saying, let me jump first. I think I can give two easy examples. We can consider two siblings in a home, and a parent chooses to treat with one a different way, and they're probably both teenagers, one 14, one 15, one 15, one 13, whatever it is. And usually there are little reasons why we might treat with them differently, but it could easily be perceived if a parent chooses to allow or proclaim that, listen, nobody would have any access to this, or nobody will be going there, or should do this. And somehow we allow one of them to do it, or we allow the boy to do it and not the girl, or we allow the girl to do it and not the boy. And some one of them could say, but how could you? Why should you? And then you want me to do this. And so they resist when you give an instruction. And that could easily be interpreted as rebellion over time. And then you have the simple example of, you talked about modeling, and that is so much more important than sometimes I think people give credit to it for. Because you tell a child ABC, you do this, but the child's natural tendency would be to follow what they've seen, because they learn it vicariously anyway. And so when you tell them don't, they may easily tell you, but how could you tell us don't? It's like pardon me for using this example, but in education I use that sometimes. The teacher who goes to teach children about abstinence from sex, who goes before a class unmarried and pregnant, they've lost moral authority to do that. And while the child might not say much there and then, in the case of a teenager or a child at home, they may feel the courage at a certain point to say, but how you could tell me that? What's going on with you? How did you get there? And they're not willing to comply, to follow with those kinds of instructions, because what's being instructed is not consistent with what has been taught by way of model. So I can raise those kinds of examples.
Dr. Samuel, how do we differentiate then between that, which David just explained, in terms of identifying what, I don't want to use the word natural per se, but natural rebellion, and sinful inclinations that are then rebellious? Because within the Christian perspective, it is the fact that as humans by nature, we are rebellious, right? You give us rules and regulations and we want to push boundaries, etc. But I think when we talk about the rebellious child, we're taking it a step further, and you can replace child with adult, etc. We're talking about someone who is inclined to just defy moral authority or any type of authority. So can you give us an example of sinful inclination when we talk about rebellion in children, and perhaps how that's learned?
Well, I guess what the Bible says, we are born in sin and shaped in iniquity. So we know, because of the Adamic nature, we somehow have that trait of going against the principles of righteousness, where we feel that desire to move away from the things that are perceived as righteous. For example, if you say don't steal, don't lie, don't treat people unkind, and so those principles of righteousness, where we are taught that we should follow these values because these are the way God wants us to live. And then you find that even though we were taught those things, and even though we were made to understand the benefits and the value of them, we can find ourselves still having a desire to go against those things. And let's go against, so there is, and it's somehow on the inside of us, there is that desire to just, sometimes like you tell a child, don't touch, and exactly what you said, don't do is exactly what they plan to do. But so I think it's just more than that. It's just because there's a nature. I think Paul talks about sometimes in us, I want to do right, but I find myself having a desire to do wrong. So there is a struggle on the inside, where we can feel a fight of the sinful nature or the human desire, rebelling against the righteousness of God, that which represents what is righteous and what is morally right and what God expects of us as an individual and as a child. So from a child, we can still have the temptation, it's a lie, not to tell the truth, or to steal the cookies, or to take things without asking permission. Yeah. And then, we can start to treat people unkind, and we can start to move over into other things, other practices where we know we should wait until we do certain, until we have a certain age and we do things a particular way, we are allowed to have certain experiences. But then, by nature, we feel like I'm young and I'm feeling emotions and I'm feeling all these things happening on the inside. Why should I wait? And then my friends are telling me it's okay. Mm-hmm. So just that natural, on the inside of us, that human struggle, that is just, we know is the right thing to do, but we struggle to do it because of feelings, and we feel an internal nature wrestling against what we know is right. And then, and that's a sinful nature.
Yeah.
And in us, I think the Bible says stubbornness is in the heart of a child, but a rod of correction drives it out. And I know that's not what we want to hear, but there is that, so because of that sinful nature, we have that inclination. And that's why is with the teachings of the principles, we are guided to fight and to resist these types of behavior and thoughts and feelings. And as we follow through, having a relationship with God, we are learning now how to draw from Him, draw from His word, so we can fight against this nature of rebellion on the inside of us, that sinful nature that eventually, as we get older, it becomes murder, it becomes crime, it becomes sin against humanity, and it goes on and on. If from a young age is not practiced to follow through on praying, reading God's word, following those principles of righteousness, then that nature of rebellion takes over. And then we become lawbreakers, and then we're disrespectful to adults, and the list goes on.
Yeah, Dr. Samuel, you just went straight into some of the long-term effects of actually not dealing with rebellious children. So, David, I want to come back to you to just precursor that and ask, is there a particular way that we tend to identify rebellion within a child? So we're gonna, whichever age group you decide, because what I'm hearing from you is that there's a cause and effect with rebellion, and as as Reverend Samuel said just now, you're talking about the natural struggle, sinful nature, the human struggle. You want to do what's right, but the temptation is so much to do what's wrong, and there's this pull and this tug and what you're seeing on TV. And so I'm also hearing that there are different types of rebellion. It might be situational, behavioral, developmental, psychological. So I guess my major question to you is there another way that we perhaps hadn't considered, or if there's any one of these you really want to go into in terms of identifying rebellion in children? Then Dr. Samuel would have spoken about some of the effects, long-term effects of rebellion. And then I want to ask us to have the conversation around how we treat with each of these types of quote unquote rebellion in children. Unmute. Still muted, let me see.
So, right. So there's a lot there that you just put forward for us to unpack. But I want to spend a little time talking about some forms of rebellion, particularly as it relates to children acting out. And these, while Dr. Samuel spoke about the natural tendency for children, us being born in sin, and I want to piggyback on that and say that because our natural instincts and desires are self-preservatory, in other words, we always want to preserve self. So we lie because we don't want to get ourselves in trouble. We cheat because we want to give ourselves an advantage. And Dr. Samuel is right about the possible long-term consequences about that. But there are some forms of rebellion that come where children are less in control of it, where it's not as deliberate, but it comes out. So children act out a number of things, particularly that they don't get to express, they don't get to articulate or talk about. And so there are some actions that show memories that have been repressed. So actions like prostitution, promiscuity, and violence towards others, those are in fact forms of rebellion. They're rebelling against something. They're resisting something that they didn't get a chance to talk about, to articulate. Then you have actions sometimes that show an attempt to solve a problem. So sometimes people run away from home, or they tend not to go to school. In education settings, you see that. And those are actions that are an attempt to rebel against, to resist something. And then the challenge becomes finding out what exactly is it that is running away, is rebelling against. And most times it could be any number of different things, experiences at home, something, it could be abuse. But then there are actions that also show the testing of limits.
Yeah.
They test limits, and it's a form of resistance. It's a form of rebellion, but we're pushing to see how far we can go. So disobedience, mommy said this, daddy said this, but we want to see if they're really going to deliver on what they said, so we can know how far we can push the boundaries to be able to see how much we'll get away with. Some forms of aggression might be that as well. Even things like experimental and substance abuse, they reflect actions of rebellion that show the testing of some limits, right? And I just wanted to point out those as further actions that we can associate with rebellion that don't necessarily fall easily under the ones Pastor Samuel, Dr. Samuel described in terms of our natural spiritual condition and wanting to rebel against what is spiritually required in terms of moral values and all that.
And what I like about what you've just identified, David, is that, oftentimes we would look at someone who's a substance abuse user and we would label them a particular way and we would cast judgment, right? And not in the godly way. We'd be judgmental against that person and not say, well, perhaps there was a situation that led this person down that pathway. And you only tend to find counselors trying to explain why that person potentially ended that way. So having seen that there are different types of behaviors that can be reflections of whether it's childhood trauma or situations, etc., I want to bring in the concept of dealing with those expressions of rebellion in children. What is the first thought that should take precedent when we see these types of behaviors in children?
Right. Doc, you were going?
No, you're going.
Okay. So the first thought, for me, I mean, I think rebellion is the term, a lot of people use it and understand it more linguistically than they do psychologically. So somebody said, this boy is a rebellious boy.
Mm-hmm.
And people get an impression as to what that means. But as a clinician, as a therapist, when you hear rebellion, that doesn't mean very, very much. Because you need to dig deeper. You need to find what the real issue is.
Yeah.
That has been reflected in this rebellion. So rebellion doesn't mean much. And then one has to filter that through the developmental stage of the child. Because the person who complains about rebellion, a lot of times parents come to me and they come complaining about their children at age 6 and 7 and 5. And somebody recently met, no, I need you to counsel my child. How old is the child? I'm quick to ask age. How old is the child? Oh, the child is 7. And I said, well, in most of these cases, the person who really needs the counseling is the parent, because children mostly reflect and mirror the environment they're in. And so quickly, I want to begin to look at the developmental stages of the children or the persons in question, because that will add context to what's happening. And then begin to give them a listening ear. You see that? Because coming from what I just shared, you see, not being able to articulate what the problems are. Go to any school and the students who are most miserable and whose behaviors are most challenging, if you give them the opportunity just to be heard, to articulate their grievances and to say, I disagree with this, I have a problem with this is unjust, this is biasness, that's unfair, let them articulate, and you see how much easier it becomes to reach them and to be able to say, listen, I hear what you say, there's some merit in it, but look at this side. And then they hear you, they listen to you. But if you don't give them the opportunity to be heard, then there's no way you can infuse any nugget of truth, knowledge, wisdom into their situation, because they're totally unresponsive and resistant to it, or they are rebellious. And so the listening element, I think people underestimate the value of listening as a tool, as a skill inside of helping these so-called rebellious children. If that's done, you're on a serious road, one, to understanding the challenge. You might understand its traumatic experiences in the past, or its current life living conditions, or it's some frustration over something. It could have been a broken relationship, could have been a dysfunctional family, some form of abuse that's ongoing, and you'll discover the things that contribute to that. So the listening would give you insights and a platform to better understand where the challenges are coming from and what informs the resistance and the rebellion. And so you'll be better able to try to assist based on what the problem really stems from.
Okay. So Dr. Samuel, again, following on from what David said, and I like it that you said listen. And what came to mind when you said listen, David, is that word vent. Allow the child to vent. But I'm hearing you saying it's not just about them venting, it's also about us as adults listening with understanding, so that once we listen and we understand, it gives us a lot more information so that we can treat with the behavior or the root cause of that behavior, not necessarily with the symptoms that we're dealing with. We kind of just want to deal with the symptoms and move on because we have 30 children in the class, etc. But I'm hearing you saying we have to listen with understanding, because once they feel heard and understood, it then gives us an opportunity to guide. I'm going to just check the chat and see if anybody has any questions before we move on. Please, if you have a question, a query, No question is a silly one. Every query, every comment is going to be heard and addressed. Our third panelist, just for information, is having some problems connecting. So we're going to take our time and go through the topic with David and with Roger. And, we're going to see if we can have Sister Stanislaus connect with us at some point. I see a hand is raised. Please go ahead, unmute and ask your question.
Hi, good night.
Good night.
I
Good
do
night.
have a question. I know of a situation where one parent is trying to teach the child, for example, like picking up clothes when they're home. They don't put it in the dirty clothes laundry, those type of things, right? But the other parent does not do it either. But getting that other parent to change or to switch quickly or to even, it's difficult. How does one parent deal with that with the child when they see the other parent modeling the behavior that you don't want them to? And it may not be an easy fix to the problem.
I'll leave it open to any of you to address. That is a fantastic question. Thank
Yes,
you.
it certainly is. It certainly is. But I think the challenge here is less the rebellion with the child than it is the inconsistency between the parents.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the situation needs to be treated with first and foremost. So I think there needs to be conversation, there needs to be dialogue, there needs to be discussion over, listen, how important this is. Why do we need to deal with this? And probably, given the fact that we are creatures of habit, we may need to spend some time breaking the habit of the parent first, if we understand the value of modeling that behavior, if that behavior is significant enough. But mind you, I want to caution, because there are times in the process to get the clothes off the ground, we break a lot more things that, in my view, are a lot more significant than the clothes on the ground, because we will die and go to heaven and the clothes will stay wherever. And I'm hoping that I'm not sounding a little bit callous here, but the conversation needs to be with the parents first, to be on the same page, or at least attempting to be. Even if one parent needs to say, listen, I'm not doing the right thing, I need to be doing the right thing too, so that they understand that parent who is at fault here is acknowledging that it's not a correct behavior. It's something that they're working on too. So the child can't feel comfortable or feel I'm torn between two worlds. They're hearing one message, even though daddy or mommy may not be doing it, but they acknowledge that it's a fault of mine. It's something I'm willing to correct. So I might be doing this. I want to do better. I'm working on it. And that is not the same as do as I say, not as I do. It's an acknowledgement that I'm in process. I'm struggling too, but I want to get there. If you can go ahead, I'll meet you, or whatever it is. But I think the conversation starts first with the parents. And once they get that, they're much closer to dealing with it than just working with the child per se, because the confusion will continue in the child's mind if the parents don't address it.
And I think to David that the parents who want clothes off the ground has to make sure they're not just demanding it from the other parents, because sometimes it might be a value to that parent, but not to the other. It's not important. So it has to be discussed. Why is it important and why we should, and like you said, so we don't just make it because it might be just something that I prefer. It probably doesn't make much of a difference. It makes a difference to me. And because it makes it different to me, I think it makes it different for the child, which of course probably does have some values and some properties. But we want to make sure it's a conversation that is, is presented in a way where it's not demanding, but it's encouraging the other parent to see, I will like this because maybe I think it's a better, however, so it's like encouraging and so that they can share and understand the importance of it. So vice versa, when the other parents have something that they're passionate about, that the other parents also see the value in it and not only what's valued to them. And so the child can then see how they trade and how they, how they communicate in terms of getting, what they want done from each other.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I'm really liking the fact that we're discussing dealing with rebellious children, but it keeps segueing back to parents. I keep seeing these ouch moments. And I think it's an opportunity for us to really reflect on, if we really do want to contribute positive members of society, it is incumbent on us as parents to model positive behaviors. And even before we start modeling those positive behaviors, like you both have said, to really discuss what are the core values we want to impart on these children. What can we say, this is a non-negotiable, and then this is a preference. Sister Stanislaus, welcome. We're just gonna continue the conversation. It's so great to have you this evening, and just feel free to jump in once you're settled in. We still have a lot of time. Again, we're dealing with rebellious children. How do we address it? And right now, before we segue into the whole concept of parenting and co-parenting with the church, I want to just go back to the whole concept of socioeconomic circumstances and rebellious children. Because a lot of times you read reports and you might be led to believe that there's a particular type of household where rebellious children come from. There's a particular type of household where long-term effects, you see the long-term effects played out more in the media from a particular type of household. Would any of you care to just speak about the whole, or demystify the concept that socioeconomic backgrounds really impact or do not impact the creation or the sustaining of rebellious children?
I know of a parent, if I may jump in there, because I this is the evil and stuff, but I know of a parent who supposedly wealthy, has their own business, and they have two children, and one is a 13-year-old boy, and the other is probably like about 4 years old. And everything is going. I mean, the father is no longer in the home, but he's in another country. But the child or the son has a relationship with him, and the child seems to get everything he wants. But one thing I discovered is that particular parent said to this 13-year-old boy, it doesn't matter whatever you do in life. It doesn't matter whatever you do in life, I'll always come and bail you out. I'll always come and get you. It doesn't matter what decision you make, what trouble you get into, whatever you do. And this particular boy is a bully, having problems in school, and his home is financially stable, but he is encouraged to be rebellious because his parents are saying, you can do whatever you want and I'll always bail you out. And sometimes we think is the kids who has little, the parents is not strong, financially.
One question and the hand raised and the old.
Dr. Sullivan, you're muted.
No, I was telling you, go ahead. I think someone's mic was just unmuted.
Yeah. So I recognize, even though that child was, supposed to be, it seems stable in terms of someone looking on financially from both parents, everything he wants, but very rebellious. And then I've come to realize, one of the reasons is because his parents encourages him and tell him he can do whatever he wants, and we will always bail you out. And I have nothing to do with the fact that very little to do with,
with socioeconomics and having money and coming from a good school. There's no face, there's no wage bracket, etc. It is about, again, parenting and value systems, etc. So when we see signs of rebellious behavior in children, I want to bring it to the parents here and co-parenting with the church. We live in a society where there's a lot of cancel culture going on. So you correct someone and all of a sudden, don't listen to this person because, they're against child rights or human rights, etc. Or, there's supposed to be freedom of expression, etc. as a parent, I have a child who's rebellious. Let's take it, 5, 6-year-old. We're in church and that child is constantly making noise. And you get the side eye from sister whoever and brother whoever, but we're not talking. Simple example of behavior that doesn't conform to authority. Is it the church's role or members of the church body to step in just to help that mother who might think it's cute to have her child yell in the middle of the sermon or in the middle of the teaching, etc., when collectively we've established that there are particular rules and regulations? How do we parent our children but still adhere to the biblical rules, biblical principles, and still be guided by our spiritual leaders? Sister Yvonne, I don't know if you want to jump in here or if you want to give Dr. Samuel or David the opportunity to continue.
I think Dr. Samuel is going to continue because I think according to the post I have here, he's supposed to be answering those questions, but I'll jump in as needed.
I think so. Maybe I was just giving you time because I think the question I answered was your question.
Okay. Well, ultimately, is the parents' responsibility to discipline their children, and when discipline doesn't begin at home, it goes on to the community, the church, and everywhere else the child might find himself. So even if the child is not being disciplined at home, it's very hard for even church members to discipline that child. But if the parents is genuinely a Christian, I think that they would be more acceptable to correction from the people that they look up to in the church, or like the pastor or deacons. They would be better able or more willing to accept advice, not necessarily correction, but advice from them. But ultimately, it's the parents' responsibility to train their child at home and let that training go on to the church. But I wouldn't hit somebody's child or try to discipline somebody's child, because I would leave it up to the parents and maybe talk to the parents later on.
Okay. All right. So then let's talk about some of the causes for children rebelling against I see we have a question. Hold 1 minute. Question is there a point when disciplining a rebellious child will not work? What does a parent do at that point? And I think that is a great segue into what causes children sometimes to rebel against the church. Because there's a point where when you rebel against the church, discipline doesn't work anymore. You think of teenage pregnancies, you think of gang violence, you think of, cohabitation, even though you're coming to church, and there's a point where, that discipline is not going to work, whether it's verbal, whether it's, alternative ways of correction. What does a parent do? What does the church do at that point in time? I see a comment in the chat says, seek professional help. So David, I'm going to come to you first.
Right. So, a lot of thoughts been going through my head as you asked the question, because when Sister Yvonne was responding, I'm thinking, sometimes we miss a lot of things in church settings. We miss a lot of things that we're supposed to be taking note of. Now, Jesus, I like to say, is one of the greatest psychologists there ever was. He was so in tune with the human condition that he understood his disciples needed food at a certain point. So he decided, let them get fed first before he go and give them the Sermon on the Mount. I hope I'm saying the right order. And he understood that these people needed to be delivered first before that. And he understood all of those things, right? But sometimes, you're talking about a 6-year-old child. And the first thought that crossed my mind is that this child should be engaged in child-centered, age-appropriate activity, even at church. And if that doesn't happen, and we have any kind of dogma or rule, albeit that it might be well-intentioned, it's asking for rebellion from a natural point of view, a natural developmental point of view, because you cannot get a 6-year-old to sit still for a 45-minute or an hour and a half sermon. It just does not work developmentally. And so they go and scream. And if not, the mother or the parent will be struggling whole time, blocking them out up and down, holding them under the arm or whatever it is, just to keep them a little bit controlled. And that parent will not be able to benefit from the sermon either. So we'd have two sets of losses. And so sometimes we miss that. And so the practicality or the practical, the pragmatics of the church in dealing with children and the developmental needs has not been the best. And we've told people things that really don't matter. I remember in one particular setting, a young man, in fact, let me tell you, it's my story, so I'll tell you. I grew up in church. And I remember once in my high teens class, I asked, how does a young man who really wants to serve God, and that was my case, I had a passion for serving God, I still do. I never left church, praise God for that. But I asked, how does a young man who loves God deal with the strong sexual urges that you feel in your teenage years? You know what the response was to me in church? John was in the spirit on the Lord's day. John was in the spirit on the Lord's day. And so I had to grapple with that to try to find out, was I carnal to be asking that question? Should I have been in the spirit like John on the Isle of Patmos? What should I have done differently about even asking that question in church? So there was no answer forthcoming. And then I determined as I grew up, I can't allow my children to grow the same way, not having the right answers in the right place. And so a lot of church programming has not addressed the real issues. And they've prayed about everything. I'm not bashing prayer. They've prayed about everything, but they've never addressed the issues meaningfully with a lot of persons. So a husband and a wife has a challenge. And before we work through the communication issues that they have, or the sex and the intimacy issues that they have, we just pray and let them loose. But that doesn't fix the inability to listen. It doesn't fix the insecurity. It doesn't fix the lack of knowledge of the physical anatomy of the woman. It doesn't fix a lot of these things. I mean, not that God can't do it that way, but we miss, because he gave us these bits of knowledge so that we have them, that we can use them. And I think a lot of times the church has failed to engage in those meaningful ways. And so children, for instance, find the information with their peers under the step at school or under the tree. And that information is a lot more scintillating for them. It's a lot more exciting. And then they get it from everywhere else. And they don't even have a stable, Christ-centered point of reference to counter or to counterbalance the information they get. And so the church loses relevance at some point because of the inability to meaningfully engage the issues. I would advance that. But I want to, let me conclude by saying programs like these make a huge dent. So commendations on keep heading in that direction.
I agree 100%.
So then my question would be, and you kind of alluded to it, David, but to be, completely directed in what you're saying, how do we move beyond having the, ephemeral response, the abstract responses to teenagers, especially? I think when we talk about being rebellious against the church, more often than not, it is about teenagers. Those are the subjects we're speaking about. How do we move away from being so abstract and so super religious that we lose exactly what you've just said? How do we bring practicality in small churches where all we've known are those responses, and we're not seeing perhaps maybe a younger generation that can bridge the gap? How do we start having those conversations?
Well, I'll tell you the truth, we need to have real talk. No pun intended, but we need to have real talk, because young people just need real, genuine conversations, and they respect you for it and they love it. I'll give you one example. In dealing with sexuality once, I raised the situation to young people. I said, listen, when you have strong sexual urges, it's a good thing. And the guys, they lit up, their eyes got, big, because why is this man telling us that in church? And I said, yes, God gave instructions to all things he created. And he said, be fruitful and multiply. I said, that's that's your sperm's natural way of wanting to respond to God's command to be fruitful and multiply. I said, nothing is wrong with that. That's even scriptural. I say, however, he gave you, as Adam, some instructions too. And you are in charge. You have dominion over all of it. I took that kind of spin. So they didn't have to feel bad about the sexual urges. They didn't have to feel bad about their sexuality, but they had to understand there was a deeper responsibility. And I'm just saying that's the kind of nature of the conversations you need to have. We need to engage sexual discussion, sexuality, and they need to stop seeing sexuality as a problematic piece of development. It is a natural part of our development. It's God-given. It's a beautiful gift from God that we need to speak about at church, and not just among children, but even for couples and people in marriages. We need to sing the songs of Solomon for them and go through some of those things so that there's life and spark and flame inside their relationships. So I think we just need to engage those conversations meaningfully and real with a Christocentric worldview on many of those things. And I think we'll be heading in that great direction.
Fantastic. And it is February, Love Month.
Absolutely.
For those couples, you need to be having those conversations. Sister Stanislaus, I want to come to you and talk about permissive versus authoritative parenting. And if you can just help us understand the difference between those two, especially in light of the comment or the question we have in the chat about, is there a point when disciplining a rebellious child will not work? And what does a parent do at that point in time?
Permissive parenting, parents are tolerant to their children. They accept the fact that their children, let me start by saying that all children are rebellious. At some point in time, every child will display rebellion. But permissive parents are different in that they allow their child to run the show. The child calls the shot. So they're afraid of conflict. And because of that, they're afraid to engage their children and give them explanations for the reasons. So a child might act up and the parent doesn't want to be involved. And so she just, turns her back or, doesn't say anything to the child. And so children grew up having that sense of control because the parents fail or are afraid to be parents. They allow the children to make demands, and they don't give children, or they're afraid to give children reasons for why rules are set or rules are made. And so the children grows up having no control and having no discipline, and it goes on to the communities in which they live.
And what about authoritarian, is there a preference between the two? Is there a point where we choose one over the other? Do we link it to a particular circumstance? What would your advice be?
Well, we tend to discipline children the way we were brought up. So because many of us in the Caribbean were brought up with authoritarian parenting, and so that's what we know. The authoritative parent is one that set boundaries, they set rules, they give the children explanations, and they're not quick to punish their children, but they listen to their children, and they give them explanations for why things are being done. Not only that, but their children are allowed to suffer consequences for their actions. And so the child knows that, mom says that, I want to go out and I want to stay at 10 o'clock at night. The authoritative parent would say, okay, let's talk about it. Let's come to a compromise. You want to go out and stay at 10 o'clock. Why? Let's decide that, okay, at 10:30. So let's reach a compromise. And so they're not quick to punish children, but to give them explanations for reasons why they set boundaries and why they set limits.
Which is not to be confused with the authoritarian
parent.
parent.
Authoritarian parent says, do this, do that, do it my way, and what I say go. And so, and most of the times the children rebel because they need explanations. They want to know why things are being said and why they're told to do things.
Yeah. So I don't know if there are any questions, comments in the chat. We do have one comment, which I think segues past Samuel. We haven't heard from you in a bit. So I'm going to come to you. We do have a comment that sometimes the church is out of touch with the language of the youth. The Bible stories in the preaching are often irrelevant to the youth's issues. So as a precursor to this question, how should pastors deal with youths who will always want to take a step beyond what the church boundaries are?
I think, in listening to David shared earlier, it really provoked me because it's not always about trying to fix as opposed to trying to understand. I think so much has to do with our ability to understand where they are, what they're dealing with, and what's happening, because sometimes they're rebelling against something and we have to try to understand what are they exactly rebelling against and what can we provide to help, because as part of their development, they will test boundaries and they will try to test, and that's part of the learning process. And we should not feel threatened by that, but sometimes use that as an opportunity to engage them and try to understand what's going on with them, where they are, and see how we can provide programs like he was describing earlier to address their situations, because maybe they're looking for answers. Maybe they're not just trying to rebel just to be against the rules. Maybe they're trying to find a way, to get to some solution. What's a better way to get things done? Maybe there's a path that they're seeking. And so I think it's important for us to really spend time to, engage them, talk with them, see what the rebellion is all about, and try to understand where they are and see what kind of programs we can provide. Because I believe oftentimes in our lives, programs were created for us without trying to understand our needs or social struggles. And so it's important for us now as leaders to know, remember how it was for us. We were young, and yes, there were these programs that, no one took time to understand what we were dealing with, what our struggles were, what we need. And so now we are the leaders. We have to now, use that to kind of understand what's their social struggle, what's happening, and then design programs with that in mind so we can cater to their needs and apply the principles of God's word to address their situation and hopefully empower them to, because something we ourselves don't know, we can empower them to create the programs for themselves. So I think it's more about us trying to understand and coming alongside of them and empowering them. Yeah.
So one of the discussions we were having in the warm-up was this whole concept of leading children, especially young adults, as a prodigal, the prodigal way, the prodigal parents way versus the Good Samaritan way. Is that something you would advocate? And I'm opening this question to all the panelists. What are the potential benefits of using, the prodigal son way of parenting and saying, have the experiences, I'm going to pray over you. So you have the intercessory prayer and the love, or using the Good Shepherd way. Start with you, Reverend Samuel.
Yeah, and definitely, because there are times in our walk and our journey, we need to, engage, go after people, seek them out, seek out their well-being, extend ourselves to them, provide them with every opportunity, with learning and growing and exposing them to all the truth and being there and working with them and understand that people have issues and you may have to be patient with them and you have to work with them. But then again, there are seasons in their lives where you would have taught and you would have taught and you would have taught, and they still want to make their own decisions. And every parent knows that as much as you want the best for your children, you cannot decide for them. And so you still have to give them that space to make their own decisions, even though they may not be the ones that you prefer. But you're hoping that the values and the principles that you would have taught them, that somewhere in their rebellion or somewhere along their prodigal son journey, they will come to themselves. And you will be there waiting to love them, because love sometimes, as we know, love suffers long, love endures, love believes, love waits. And it can be painful to watch a child of yours make some, of course, as an adult, make some terrible decisions, and you would have guided them, but you cannot control it, and you cannot, at that point or at that stage, they have to learn, and they have to learn, on their own. So sometimes it's painful, but you have to let them come to themselves and love them from a distance. And you're still waiting so that when they come back, you are there to receive them, and not to say, I told you so. Not waiting to say, didn't I tell you? But waiting to put a ring on their finger and have a big party and welcome them back. And that sometimes could feel difficult, but that's part of what we're called to do, because we've had seasons in our own lives where we were hoping that in our own rebellion, someone was there, to love us back into the fold. And so I think it's important to demonstrate this two types of love, where we work with people, and at some other stage, we give them that space to make their own decisions. And when they make the wrong decisions, we're there to love them back.
Totally agree. David, Sister Yvonne?
It depends on the child. Some children don't learn even if you run after them, and they have to hit rock bottom. They have to really feel the results and the consequences of their action before they look up and realize that, what they're doing. Other children, they go out there, but they want to come back, but they need encouragement. They're afraid to approach you as the parent. And so you have to know who you're dealing with. You have to know the personality of the child. You have to know, what kind of circumstances there. If their child, if they're really suffering out there, you may want to go and try to reach them. But even sometimes in those situations, the child doesn't want you to get involved in his or her life. And so you have to give them room to find their way. Many of them find their way back to you, while at the same time keeping yourself open as the prodigal father for whenever the time comes that they're ready to come back, you're ready to receive them.
Doc, I will just add, the prodigal father for me shows, as Dr. Samuel was saying, both ends of the spectrum, because I'm quite confident that the father, prior to his son's leaving, must have instilled something that his son eventually, when he came to his senses, said, but look at that, I have a father, so that's the values we're talking about there. And I'm certain he may have tried all the other methods. He may have tried to be a little more authoritarian, he may have supported, he may have tried to understand, and all of that. But genuine parenting is about meeting people's needs and teaching them to meet their needs. And ultimately, we hope that they will do that on their own, making their own decisions. And the prodigal father, at a certain point, allowed that. The same way, when our children are younger, we do a lot more for them. We teach a lot more. We direct a lot more. As they get older, we ease back and allow them a little more space, a little more room to exercise what we've taught them, to put it into practice. And that's when the real test comes. And so probably even the prodigal father tried and he realized it wasn't happening. He dressed back. But I think very useful is his disposition to his son when he came back. And I think that's the beautiful part that we need to take in treating with rebellious children, a disposition. They must know that, listen, I think you're going to make a bad decision. I think you're going to get hurt if you go down that road. I think you're going to damage your future prospects if you don't change this behavior. But there's so much potential in you. There's so much greatness inside of you. All of that will be compromised if you don't change that. But the disposition must be a welcoming one. That if they do decide, listen, I need to go back and say sorry, they know they can find somebody who is disposed, who's open to being spoken to, and not somebody, me, I could never go back to him because he will just take it to another level. And so that disposition is a great thing from the prodigal father that I think is very useful in treating with rebellious children, to add to what was said by the two panelists.
Thank you. So let's look at a practical example of these two types of dealing with a rebellious child. You're the parent. You have an unmarried young man or woman who's parented two children living at home with you. How do you deal with that person while still attending church? And these are some real scenarios. So in theory, it sounds great and we know it can work. What happens when theoretical meets the practical? Child has two children, unmarried, living at home. We're still attending church. What are some of the challenges you see happening there, and how might we treat with it? I'm going to come to Reverend Samuel first, Sister Yvonne, and then to David.
Put that joke on. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. Well, I mean, it's a situation where, you know, I think like we shared before, you guide, you support, and you provide as much as you could. And at the end of the day, people, when they are adults, they make their own decisions and you cannot decide for them. And the only difference is now they're living in your house, right? And so you have to deal with the situation face on. I mean, at some point in time, Pastor Henry would have made reference where he told Trevor and probably not Kathleen, probably mostly Trevor. After a while, he have to move out. He have to look for his own house. He have to look for. So I don't know if that's part of what Pastor Henry would have suggested here. So of course, we encourage our children to become independent. And of course, I don't know if it's a male or female, but how to become independent and self-sufficient. And we empower them to take care of their responsibilities. So if they make a decision to have children and they're not married, they have a responsibility to take care of those children. And of course, you can help the best way you could, but the rules are the same. You're still required to love them, whether they're in your house or out of your house. And but you may have to also encourage them and empower them to make decisions to ensure that they are responsible and that they will make more responsible decisions. And if they continue to make decisions that are irresponsible, then you have to then guide them as to what they need to do, find a own home, and things of that nature to take care of the family. So you won't have the responsibility to just always be taking care of decisions that are not always the best, but you still have to be as supportive as you can. And I'll let the other panelists put their spin because you said I already put them more. No, I'm just kidding.
As a parent, I don't see my son who has two children living in my house. I think that if you are a man, maybe you had one child, you made a mistake, but two children tells me that you're ready you should be able to take responsibility and get your own place and take care of your children. So I don't see myself as a parent, even if you're still going to church. What I would do as a parent is to encourage you to get your own place. I would encourage you, maybe help you with your first rent or whatever in finding a place, but I would not encourage you to remain in my house, because remaining in my house is I'm enabling you to continue the kind of a lifestyle that you live in. That's how I would address it as a parent. I would help you as much as I can, but I would not encourage you to live at home. because you have a responsibility to take care of your children, to find a job. And the longer you stay home, is the more comfortable you probably would be. That's my
I want to veer along the lines of Sister Stanislaus. Well, I support what Pastor Samuel said as well. But I think the first thing I noted in response to the question was, there are two problems here. One, the fact that the my house part is an issue for me. The question of the love and support for that child is a non-issue. I'm going to love them. I'm going to support them. The my house part reflects a violation of my space, a violation of my personhood and all of that. And then it adds again, it supports a practice, but I would think it's becoming a practice, right? Now, one, you think, okay, a mistake. Let's see if we can, let's find the underlying problem. And in fact, that's one of the things too. There, obviously, to get to two means that there is a more pervasive problem that hasn't been addressed, that's showing up itself repeatedly. And so more work has to be done, even if it means getting it done professionally to see if it can be found. So there's a problem that needs to be addressed. And then the issue of my house is a second problem. But I agree, I would probably try to encourage them, find their own space if they can't comply with, if they can't work here, if they're not comfortable. But there are obviously underlying issues. And coming back to the prodigal father, I suspect the prodigal father may have been probably in a case where he says, son, this thing will not serve your interest at this point. It can't work well now. You would be better served if the resources and the assets are put, it will come to better maturity at a certain point. It's not the best thing I propose under what the scheme that I have here in this family. And he felt, no. All right, well, as you see fit, it won't work here. He said, Daddy, I won't go. Yeah, well, he goes. So I wouldn't encourage it, but I'll support the child the best way I can, but probably not in my house.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think this is a part, it kind of segues into the whole concept of you, yes, are the parent and ultimately responsible. But when we talk about the church or being Christian educators, being Christian parents, and having issues like this, you talk about the church being complementary. And so I just want to open up to the audience and perhaps invite Pastor Griffith to give a comment on the scenario we've paved. I also want to acknowledge Dr. Neff. It is great to have you with us, Dr. Neff, and thank you for your comment. She says, the rebellious child is not a new phenomenon. When Jane Eyre was published in 1847, the world became aware that children can be passionate, angry, and even defiant. The book was based on the life of the author, who was a pastor's kid. What do you say to church members who look at the rebellious behaviors of pastors' children, yet have to deal with the pastor who does not hesitate to reprimand their children's misbehavior? So, perfect comment to invite Pastor Griffith to just comment on the church being complementary in helping us parent children or helping us address rebellious behavior in our children. Pastor Griffith.
Hi, good night. I don't know if I can answer the question the way it's actually posed. I rather want to make the comment that I do not know how we could accept rebellion. The idea of church, the idea of sin is actually rebellion, where an individual or man wants to do his own thing, and that we need to instill, whether it be in church, whether it be at work, that there are boundaries, and once we step off the boundaries, then there are consequences. So whether it is occurring in the church or in the house, we will want to see if we can do something to help people to recognize that you are living in a responsible society and you have boundaries. So we will need to see if we can intervene and to help rehabilitate one way or the other in every instance. But if you have people who are actually rebelling, there has to be consequences. And when we address the matter of dealing with children in our homes that are rebellious, I mean, again, as parents, we find ourselves in a hard spot. There are Christian parents who have children in their houses, who, for example, we said get pregnant. Then we put them out. Then what happens? Can they pay rent? Can I afford to pay rent sustainably? What do I do? We would have heard so many stories about parents in the olden days when the pastor or the sister had to go in the back seat. Now we need to be clear as to where we are going. I will end by simply saying is that the subject of rebellion is not easy. Why do my teenage young people, why are they rebellious? Rebellious means what are the boundaries that they are violating? There are certain boundaries in the church that is wrong. I don't know how I help, but it's not easy at all. I pause.
Thank you, Pastor Griffith. It is just about 8:47 p.m. So we are actually rounding the bend. I feel like we actually just started the conversation and we could just go off in so many different directions, speaking about rebellion in children. But just to kind of map out where we've started and where we are now, we identified what rebellion was. And, that is just behavior that goes against those in positions of authority or who's exercising dominion at that point in time. We identified different types or different causes of rebellion. We looked at how we recognize different types of rebellion or rebellious behavior in children. And we really grappled with understanding whether it was situational, behavioral, developmental, psychological. We looked at rebellious behaviors and what they can suggest for a child who is behaving like that, and whether it is prostitution, testing limits, aggression, or just experimenting. Is it a cry for help, or is it a child who just really wants to push boundaries? And then we looked at how we address rebellion and parenting in love, or being an authority figure in love, giving children the opportunities to vent or to express themselves and to listen with understanding, so that they would be open to the idea that as an adult or as an authority figure, we would be willing, or we are now able to impart some knowledge, perhaps based on our experiences with them. And then how do we resolve rebellion? We spoke about leading as the good shepherd. Are we going to take the prodigal father's approach? But ultimately, intercessory prayer and love, and the fact that while parenting is the ultimate responsibility of those in the home, the literal and figurative home, the place, the parental abode, or where you impart your family values, that it should be complementary as Christians with our church community as the body of Christ, to ensure we continue making disciples of Christ, so to speak, and raising up disciples and future evangelists, etc., in our communities who can stand firm. So I want to give our panelists an opportunity to just, say some final comments. I want to ask if there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask a question, make a comment. Please put it in the chat if you don't want to unmute your mic, so that we can ask the question on your behalf. So panelists, over to you. What are your final takeaways on this whole concept of rebellion or the rebellious child, and how we deal with them from a Christian perspective? I'm going to come to Dr. Samuel. Yes, I see you're ready to go. And then I'm going to ask Sister Yvonne, and then I'm going to come to David.
I think of the ultimate response, because the world is all rebellion, in terms of the world of sin is rebellion. And God's approach was John 3:16 to rebellious world and generation. He extended his love. He says, for God so loved the world, whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting. He gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And so I recognize that God extended his love and to correct the rebellion in humanity, his love to draw us out of a rebellious place into a place of truth and liberty and freedom. And so when we refuse that love, then we embrace the ultimate punishment. Not that God punishes us, our decision leads us there. But God provides the option and the opportunity to accept, to heal, and to resolve. And so I'm grateful for that example that God gave in rescuing me. And I'm trying to model the same in extending his love to my generation.
Okay, I want to say that even wrong lanes have right turns, and children thrive when they have support from parents, when they receive support from parents, from families, from their communities, from their churches, and when they're able to establish some relationships with the parents, teachers, and community. And so there is hope for rebellious children, as long as they have that supportive system, and we're not willing to necessarily condemn them or write them off, but we're there to uphold them, encourage them, instruct them, and love them. I think there is hope for them in making the right turn, and being effective and assets to the communities in which they live.
Right. So to add to what my illustrious colleagues have shared, I would want to suggest to parents who may be struggling with children they deem challenging or rebellious, I want to encourage all to see those rebellious children through a lens of their potential, rather than just the rebellion. Because I've come to realize, if we're not careful, we can find ourselves caught in the moment of the rebellion, in the 4 months or the 6 weeks or the 2 years of rebellion, and forget that this is the child that we've had great aspirations for the time he gets to 21 or he gets to 24. And sometimes we can take decisions and take actions that can paint the rest of their future in a different slant. And I want to encourage us to see the rebellious child through the lens of his God-given potential as you treat with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure hosting the session this evening. I'd like to open the floor for any comments, any questions. And while we wait on persons to post in the chat, Pastor Henry, I'd like to hand it over to you to make some final comments. Oh, we do have a question. How do parents guard against gender biases in response to rebellious youth rebellious behaviors? How do parents guard against gender biases in response to rebellious youth or rebellious behaviors? One panelist who'd be willing to take that on.
Okay,
David, would you mind if thank you.
Yeah. So I think if we have a values-based position within the family, and we know this is the value that's being preserved here, values go across gender. While the behavior may come across differently because of the gender, if the value that you preserve, that you present, that you work for is the same, and you can work with your children to make them see that this is the value here that's being preserved, I think you'd be on a platform to be able to treat across the genders with your children, the rebellious children or the rebellious behaviors.
Thank you, David. I do see a quick hand. Trevor, go ahead, Trevor Benjamin, and then we'll hand over to Pastor Henry.
Good evening, panelists. Thank you very much for accepting my raised hand. For most of us who grew up in the Caribbean, our parents had one form of discipline, and we know exactly what that was. Truth be told, we did not turn out that badly after all. Now that we live in the new country, we seem to have gone to the other end of the spectrum, where we do a lot of talking and taking away privileges, etc. And very often, those activities don't yield the results that we're seeking. Is there still a place in our Caribbean homes for the type of discipline that was meted out to us that caused us to be so focused and to be so far ahead in our careers in life as individuals, even though we live in this new country.
David, I'm going to come right back to you as well, and perhaps ask Dr. Samuel if he wants to add to your comment as a traumatologist and a counselor on the panel.
Right. So great question. Is there a place for the kind of discipline? I'm not sure I'd say that, because in many ways, I think in my own experience, as a person who's experienced lots of corporal punishment at home, I think it was excessive in many, many ways for simple things. And I can go and give you several examples. Even at school, you'd get licks for taking more than 5 seconds to answer a multiplication tables and all of those things. So I think in many cases, its application was excessive. Is there a place for it? Yes. In the same way, to be applied in the same way, I would suggest not. But there's a place for it. And let me say why. I don't like the use of the strap as traditionally purported. I think people misuse it, misunderstand it, use it without love, which is the only basis on the scripture to use it in my mind. Whom he loves, he chastens. And if the love is not felt or understood or effectively appreciated by the person who is being disciplined or punished through that medium, then it will not serve the purpose for which it's intended. From a psychological point of view, there is a place for the application of bodily stimulus or corporal punishment to persons, particularly when children are younger. And you want to get them to discontinue with immediacy a behavior for which the natural consequence would be too severe. So if a child wants to pull a hot pot of water down, and you just know that that hot pot of water will disfigure that person for the rest of his or her life, an immediate slap will serve the purpose of immediate deterrence. Now, there is a place for that kind of thing. And if a child wants to threaten to run across the road on a busy street when told not to, a serious slap or some kind of infliction of that kind of corporal punishment type will immediately get their attention. This is not something that can be tested. You don't want to experience the natural consequence of it, right? So there's that kind of place. And that is most applicable in the younger stages of the children's lives. Once they begin to get older, all the experiences suggest its utility got less. I remember growing up at a point, and then we just said, listen, we go get lashed, but so, say what? And we just went ahead and did it anyway. We stayed out and played the marbles because we knew we were going to get licks. And it did not make a difference after a point. So the bigger they get, the less useful it becomes. So I can say, yes, there's a place for it, but not to be used in the same traditional way. I've seen people 18, 19 getting licks with all kinds of stuff. It just doesn't make as much sense. I think it generates more rebellion than it helps. And if you ask me, I'm not sure that has contributed to our well-being as much as the nuclear type family that we had, as much as the community support that we had, as much of the value-based society that we've had. And now we don't have those things. We have individualistic type, if it works for me, we have relativistic type philosophies. We have all of these things. We have dysfunctional families. All of these things have changed. And several times we don't include those in our discussions. And we think that the only thing that has changed is our perspective on corporal punishment. And I think we've missed seeing the whole picture if we want to discuss this matter totally. That's my submission.
I agree totally. Everything David, no need to add anything else. That's exactly what I would say. Thank you.
All right, so I hear you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Neff adds that a child's behavior is a result of some underlying condition triggering that behavior. Parents must take the time and care to quickly determine what is triggering the rebellious behavior and address the trigger before putting a Band-Aid on that behavior. So yes, don't address the symptoms, try to find the root cause. So thank you so much. Pastor Henry, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Neff. I sat there and I listened to David, and I think what is happening, and the question that was asked about the discipline, I think as we drift further from 1834, the abolition of slavery, we tend to lessen discipline. I think that's the focal point. My mother told us a story when we were growing up. Her mother, I knew her, my grandmother, she was just a little over 4 feet. My mother was 5 feet 10. And my mother said that she was ironing her husband's, my father's pants. And her mother, my grandmother, said something to her, and she stoops. And my grandmother pulled a bench, stood on the bench with the strap in her hand, and gave her a trash in for stooping at her mother in front of her husband.
Good for them.
So we have gone far from that. We have gone far from that. But this has been a great discussion. It has been a great discussion. One that I think that we should continue. Yes, I know also a parent, I saw it, we were having camp, and I know also a parent that he spoke to his son and said, stop running. And the little fella continued to run with a stick in his hand. And when he heard the call to come here, he came, and the parent asked him, why are you still running with that stick? He said, I was bringing it to you because I know you would beat me. So things are changing. Yes, it's great. And yes, I'm the type of parent too who would not support the nonsense with a first child, probably mistake, second child. No, no, you're gonna have to. I left home at 22, Sister Dr. Sutherland. I left home at 22, and I believe that every young man, once I've helped him to get a portion of education, he could function, he's supposed to leave. And the young women also do the same, find themselves a husband. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining tonight. And I know that the Sister Stanislaus, I know you had problems with, and you couldn't join us from the offset, but glad you were able to make it. Dr. Samuel, thank you as always. David, thank you. And I know that some of the things that your father has passed on to you, I am seeing them. I had the privilege of pastoring his father. Oh my goodness me, could I stop tonight? I had the privilege of pastoring David's father. And he was a guy who worked very, very hard. He would do his masonry trade, and then he would go to the garden, and then he would see about the animals and the plants and what have you. But every night we have service, Brother Andrew would come to church, and as soon as he gets to church, his head would fall on the bench and he would go to sleep. And so I said to Brother Andrew one night, Brother Andrew, why not stay home? Why don't you just stay home and take a rest? I know you work very hard. He said, Pastor Henry, you see these children? How many of you were there, David? 9 or 10?
11.
11. He said, you see these children? Not one of them will blame me and stay home and saying that I am not going to church. So he modeled his behavior that he wanted for his children. So when David tells you that he grew up in church, he literally grew up in church because he didn't have anybody to stay home with. All right, but it's a great program, great program.